Good. Okay. So we have a bit of a thorny issue, which is subject to a fair amount of contention and a larger amount of neglect. Services. We've got three speakers who know a good deal about it. I'm not Sherry Stephenson, George Riddell, Hamid Mamdouh. I'm not going to use valuable time introducing them and telling you about their sterling backgrounds. You can read it off the invitation to the meeting. So just let me make a few comments on services. I mean, it is one of the strange things really is it's the dominant source of value in the world economy when it's calculated correctly. And yet we didn't even start talking about it until the 80s and 90s as a topic for international negotiation at the multilateral level. And since we started, not an awful lot has happened. Now, sometimes I ask my friend Hamid whether this is an architectural issue or whether there are other explanations, but we'll leave that till later because he loves having those conversations. I think, first of all, let's give each of the speakers 10 minutes to introduce the topic. We'll start with Sherry, then we'll go to George, and then we'll go to Hamid, and let's see where this takes us. We will finish punctually at 3:30 Geneva time. Okay, Sherry, you have the floor.
Thank you, Patrick. Very pleased to be here. Pleased to take up this very important but neglected topic on the trade agenda, which is what can the WTO do about services trade, and why hasn't it done more? I have my own thoughts on this, but my role in this panel is first to set the stage for our discussion. So in my mind, this question should be framed in an even bigger picture. Why did the last WTO Ministerial Conference not address services trade substantively at all in its preparatory discussions? And why have no negotiations on services been carried out at the WTO for the past 15 years? This lack of attention seems incomprehensible when we consider the importance of services in the world economy. Services account for 65% on average of world GDP. Over half of employment in the world is in services. 2/3 of all new foreign direct investment flows go into services sectors. And as Patrick said, when measured on a value-added basis, over half of world trade is constituted by services. Additionally, and critically, we are now in the digital age, and it is digital services trade that has been the most dynamic, fastest growing area of world trade for the past 2 decades. Trade in digitally delivered services is cited as the main avenue which offers developing countries the opportunity to increase their share of trade, break into global value chains, and climb up the skills ladder without huge capital expenditure. Yet despite this overwhelming and growing importance of services, we have witnessed the following in the past 15 years. No new multilateral negotiations have been initiated on services at the WTO since 2009. No attempt has been made to reignite the sectoral or cluster negotiations of groups of related services sectors. There has been a lack of success in attempting to incorporate services into the environmental goods negotiation. And there has been little to no discussion of digital services trade issues in the WTO Services Council or any attempt to negotiate an update within the WTO to existing GATS rules to take into account digital realities. Though GATS rules clearly apply to cross-border services trade carried out in digital form, from principle of technological neutrality and is guided by the basic disciplines of MFN, non-discrimination, and national treatment, there are several aspects specific to digital trade that are not covered in the GATS rules. And at MC13, services were missing from substantive discussions. Some may disagree with this characterization and say that there were actually 2 big gains in the services area at the recent ministerial meeting. But I think it is useful to examine more closely what actually happened. The 2 major outcomes from MC13 cited in the area of services are, first, the announcement of the certification of revised schedules of services commitments so that the plurilateral outcome on services domestic regulation could be incorporated into these schedules and become effective. Now, this is a major achievement indeed for the world trading system, given that it is estimated by the OECD that implementation of this agreement on services domestic regulation will result in the estimated reduction in global cost to services trade of over $125 billion. This outcome, however, is the result of a plurilateral effort, which initiated outside the WTO Services Council and which was actually agreed and finalized in November 2021, long before MC13, but had been stalled by objections from India and South Africa for over 2 years. These countries lifted their objections for some of the schedules in time for an announcement at MC13, which was hailed as a ministerial outcome, but in reality had nothing to do with the ministerial meeting. In fact, the content of the certified schedules was not discussed and remained unchanged, and there are still 16 member services schedules being challenged. So I want to emphasize the importance and significance for the WTO of this tremendous achievement in the services area, since these disciplines on services domestic regulation will represent a major boost to services trade and will be applied on a multilateral basis. But this achievement had nothing to do with MC13 and should have been implemented much sooner. Second, extension of the e-commerce moratorium for 2 more years. The decision to keep digital trade open without the application of customs duties on electronic transmissions was also hailed as a major achievement at the recent ministerial conference, and it proved indeed challenging to reach agreement for this extension. But the e-commerce moratorium was first agreed by WTO members long ago in 1998 as part of the WTO work on e-commerce and has simply been extended ever since. So it was not a new outcome of MC13, but rather the extension of an ongoing outcome now scheduled to terminate in 2 years at end March 2026 or at the next ministerial conference. So, was there anything new for services at MC13? There was one paragraph in the ministerial declaration on services with encouraging but weak language, reading, "We, the ministers, commit to reinvigorate work on trade and services within the mandate of the GATS, including through further thematic evidence-based discussions." Now, although it is good that services were included in the ministerial declaration, this paragraph omits something very important. It does not mandate any renewed negotiations on trade and services within the WTO. It simply commits to more work and more discussions. So with this as background, on the WTO side, it's instructive to look at what has been happening in parallel to this stalemate at the WTO on services these past 15 years. The world has not stood still. First, there has been the conclusion of some major regional trade agreements that contain WTO plus disciplines in several key areas affecting services, including regulatory coherence, digital trade or e-commerce, SMEs, and others. We can think of the USMCA, the EU trade agreement with Canada, and EU agreements with other countries, and the CPTPP, among others. Second, we have witnessed the proliferation of standalone digital economy agreements outside the WTO. These digital economy agreements are not incorporated into RTAs, but stand by themselves. Many have binding provisions, others contain best endeavor or cooperative clauses. An example of one among 10 or 11 recent digital economy agreements is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. Third, a plurilateral negotiating initiative on e-commerce was begun in January 2019. More than 90 WTO members have been participating in this JSI negotiations. Negotiations were very ambitious until the US unexpectedly changed its posture towards disciplines on digital trade at the end of 2023 and reversed course on 3 major issues with respect to free flow of data, forced localization of servers, and source code. As a result of this, the level of ambition of participants has been considerably lowered. A round of negotiations scheduled for this month should be the last technical discussion of a draft expected to be finalized this summer. If and when adopted, this should go quite a long ways towards filling the gap on rules for digital trade or e-commerce, but how it will be attached or incorporated into the WTO and how it will be applied remain important outstanding issues. Fourthly, there has been progress in other fora on regulatory cooperation for services. Given the importance of regulations in shaping services trade and efficiency, this is a vitally important area and one which the WTO has spent little time addressing. APEC has been examining good regulatory practices for quite a while and agreed last year on a blueprint for good regulatory practice in APEC, covering both goods and services, which the APEC economies will now try to implement. This is discussed in the policy brief that was provided to you as background for this session. So, although the outcome at MC13 was depicted as fairly rosy for services, when one looks deeper, it was actually a function of timing on one hand for the announcement of a previously finalized plurilateral agreement and continuity of a previous decision on the other. No new initiative on services within the WTO was discussed prior, during, or as a result of MC13. Yet services continued to increase in economic importance. The WTO should be at the center of efforts to open services markets, expand services commitments, increase transparency around services measures, and improve regulatory good practice for services. But it is not carrying out this role at present. So where do we go from here to turn this situation around? Over to you, Patrick, and thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. Precisely 10 minutes. That was great. Thank you. Now, George Riddell has one advantage over the vast majority of us here, I think. Not everyone, but a lot of us, in that he's been on the government side of this business, and he's also now on the private sector side. So he has both perspectives, with which I hope will enrich his comments. George, over to you.
Thanks, Patrick, and it's an absolute pleasure to be speaking with you all today and being part of this session. So really just to underline the point that Sherry was making, and I think it's this cognitive dissonance from the private sector side, who still do value the WTO, still want to be engaged, in that we have a situation where increasingly we're moving to over half of international trade, all international commerce that crosses borders, having a services component attached to it, whether that's because it's digitally delivered or because embedded within products themselves. And yet the WTO has done very little over the past number of years to address this growing proportion of world trade. And I think that, it really does come down to the crux of the future of the organization, that if it's not able to start addressing services and digital issues in a more compelling way, it will become increasingly irrelevant to the facts of global commerce. I would also add one additional point to what Sherry has mentioned in terms of the recent developments, and that's on the ongoing services work under the GATS, and in particular the transparency function. I've got a couple of fairly stark figures here that were formed sort of part of the introduction to the think piece that was circulated ahead of this session. So to date, approximately 1,140 notifications have been made under the GATS, which, if you average it out since it was agreed, comes to about 40 notifications a year. If we look at the TBT agreement, last year alone saw over 3,800 notifications made. That is just a phenomenally stark difference that does not represent the experience of services traders who are consistently dealing with new trade barriers, new trade regulations as they're developed around the world, whether it relates to AI, whether it relates to professional services regulation, whether it relates to delivery or other logistics related measures. There's a huge amount happening in this space, but it's really just not represented under the current discussions at the WTO. And that's one of the reasons why we put some thoughts down, and the think piece that was circulated ahead of this meeting is really a distillation of ideas and conversations that I have had with services representatives around the world, so colleagues. I know some are on this call here from the Global Services Coalition, as well as a number of UK based services representatives, really to try and shift from a defensive position where every 2 years we've been defending the e-commerce moratorium, and obviously there's a lot of differing views around the value of that, the importance of that, but the reality is we have seen a lot of effort put into defending the moratorium and demonstrating its value, to what could actually constitute a commercially meaningful negotiating agenda, and to really look at it more positively and saying, instead of, oh, the WTO hasn't done anything over the past number of years, to turn that conversation into what could it do and what are the opportunities to really make a difference to international trade moving forward. So we've got 11 ideas, I think they were put, and I'll just run through those quickly, because these were not meant to be a negotiating agenda per se. More it is focused on, here are some proactive ideas that would have value to explore further and accelerate where there are already some nascent discussions taking place. So the first is definitely improving the monitoring and notifications. That is absolutely fundamental. If we don't have the right data points, if we don't have the right understanding of different countries' regulatory practices, then moving these discussions forward will be incredibly difficult. I think even just a recognition of moving towards an actual representative sample of notifications would be beneficial under the current environment. The second is to pursue a more activist approach to integrating plurilateral agreements into the WTO. I know that from a political perspective, certain WTO members will find that challenging. However, for the private sector, it really is an incredibly important part that these newer initiatives around domestic regulation for services and e-commerce do take effect, are concluded and take effect as quickly as possible, because they represent the lived experience of their current trading regime. I think it is also important to encourage additional participation of those plurilateral initiatives and broadening out the base of the membership that is contributing to these different plurilaterals, because also many of them are already undertaking the same provisions as part of their FTA practice, as Sherry mentioned, around the world. I think there is a question around the commercially meaningful nature of the e-commerce joint initiative agreement at the moment, particularly with regards to the US's support or lack thereof of certain of the data flow provisions, and resolving that as quickly as possible to ensure particularly that interoperability among legal frameworks takes precedent in the final negotiation. Private sector would also like to see a permanent e-commerce moratorium, both plurilaterally and multilaterally as well. Moving on to some of the newer ideas, I would say, in terms of how we could possibly take forward the services agenda. I think there's definitely an aspect of a trade facilitation 2.0 negotiations, looking at the pandemic really highlighted the importance of logistics, transport, shipping, and other related services. And that could be, an unfinished element to the current trade facilitation agreement as it's currently structured. There's a question of environmental services and coming up with meaningful market access negotiations and taking those forwards, whether that's under the TESTI or more broadly. And then finally, we move into the what I would say the real ambitious end of the current ideas circulating among the private sector as to what they would like to see in terms of the services negotiations at the WTO, the high watermark, if you will. The GATS, and Hamid can speak at length on this, definitely provides for unilateral improvements to members' schedules of commitments, where perhaps, whether it's a current applied regime or FTA best practice, that would lock in some of the certainty around the current trading regime, and also eliminate the need for forum shopping by private sector businesses to look at which FTA they should be using, which is always a complicated question when it comes to their international trade. There's a question of market access negotiations, whether sectoral agreements could be pursued as part of that. So very much, going back to the core multilateral negotiations and taking that forward. There's a huge amount of precedence there in the GATS negotiations around Mode 4, financial services, telecoms, etc., to expand that out. And the final point, I think, that really has been missed with regards to the services agenda. We agreed the services waiver a number of years ago for the least developed countries, with the unilateral commitments that were made by a number of WTO members. If we're honest, that hasn't really been fully utilized in the same way that GSP and DFQF have been, and whether or not more could be done there to really expand that to make it meaningful for those least LDC service providers to access international markets and benefit their domestic arrangements. Recognize that that's a lot of ideas to throw on the table, but it really is part of that wanting to be proactive, wanting to spark this conversation, and then generate ideas around how we move forward. Thanks for the opportunity.
Many thanks for that, George. There's a lot of areas for action that the business sector's interested in pursuing, quite ambitious. Hamid, enlighten us, please.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and lovely to be here with all friends and new friends. And I agree with what has been said so far, of course, by Sherry and George. They've covered a lot of ground. I'm not going to repeat, but I'm going to just start with a diagnostic note. I think what we have been seeing in the WTO since the financial crisis in 2008 was a very serious leadership deficit on the part of governments in pursuing negotiating initiatives in the WTO. July 2008 was the sort of point at which the Doha round actually started losing momentum. But this is useful to recall only because we need to understand that we do have a leadership deficit that needs to be addressed. So members would have to see how this can be carried forward. And this is a WTO-wide problem. This is not just a services issue. The other thing also, from another diagnostic note, is that over the past 20 years, we've seen increasing complexity of trade policy and trade negotiating issues. Of course, we have seen the process of digitalization advancing quickly. And of course, with COVID, we've seen the process being turbocharged by the circumstances. Now, that led to a lot of innovative business models that provoked numerous regulatory responses, some of which are trade inhibiting or more trade restrictive than necessary. So this is in the backdrop. Now, I will divide my comments into 3 points. The why, the what, and the how. Why do we need to focus on services at this point? I think this point has been addressed more than adequately by Sherry and George. It's the increasing importance of services as part of the global economy. And then, of course, the process of digitalization has made services actually play a wider role in how the global economy functions and how trade relations between countries function, not just in terms of global value chains, but in terms of innovative business models as well. And then we also need to pay attention to what is going on the ground and how that links to the regulatory initiatives that are proliferating and creating a lot of regulatory diversity situations that inhibit cross-jurisdictional business. Now, all these are reasons why it's time now to really start focusing seriously on the services agenda. If that's the why, then I move to the what. What can be done specifically? And again, some of those points have been touched upon early on. The first thing is that we do have huge amounts of water in schedules. Process of autonomous liberalization has advanced in leaps and bounds, and there are lots of low-hanging fruits. Even a modest negotiating initiative can bind a lot of the current levels of openness in many countries. Another thing to do is to look at updating, the need to update the rules, including clarifying some of the existing rules. In other words, there are some corners of the rule book that we have that haven't even been clarified sufficiently. A good example is the obligation on cross-border data flows. We've been negotiating in e-commerce cross-border data flows and creating discipline on cross-border data flows, while actually we do have a discipline in the telecommunications annex, paragraph 5C. Now, it might need clarification, it might need expansion, it might need actually expanding its application beyond sectors that are listed in member schedules. It's a matter to be addressed. But we shouldn't be treating the rules that we have as if we don't have them, if they need to be developed further. Now, the system has not been updated for the past 30 years. This is also another important diagnostic point to keep in mind. And then another thing to do, this is the third point on the what, is to look at the synergies and the interaction between the services agenda as such and the ongoing negotiations in the JSI on e-commerce. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of potential synergies there. And also to see how we can take the issues covered by the moratorium forward. Now, of course, as was mentioned by Sherry and George, we've had the moratorium extended until the next ministerial, but we need to look at the substance of what the moratorium is covering and see how we need to cover it, beyond what the moratorium provides. So let's not forget the moratorium is only about customs duties. But if we look at the reality on the ground, the threat actually is going to come from other places. The threat is going to come mainly from discriminatory taxes and blocking access to the market. And our friend Simon Evanet and his team have done a lot of good work on the digital trade alert. And the facts on the ground actually reveal that there's only one country, which is Indonesia, that has contemplated the imposition of customs duties, never did. But at the same time, Indonesia has imposed value-added tax on digital products, which is, on the face of it, discriminatory because it applies only to foreign service suppliers. Now, if that is the real problem now that is starting to emerge, and I don't mean to point at Indonesia per se, there are other countries who are doing it as well. And Digital Trade Alert actually has a very nice list of what is happening on the ground. Then we need to upgrade our approach on which the moratorium was based in order to cover more adequately the trade interest behind the moratorium, which is digital services trade. Now, the how. This is the what. The how is probably we need to start thinking about how negotiating initiatives may be launched. And I would look particularly at plurilateral initiatives. Now, we need to clarify the rules on plurilateral negotiations in the WTO, because so often the conversations confuse plurilateral negotiations with plurilateral outcomes. They're two different things. Plurilateral negotiations, like JSIs, have always been the rule in the multilateral trading system. We seem to forget, really, that the only truly multilateral round of negotiations took place in the history of the multilateral system was the Uruguay round. Every other round, by definition, was a negotiation between a subset of the members. Now, until we launched the Doha round, which is a multilateral project as well, but it hasn't gone very far. We have managed to take out of it a couple of elements, namely trade facilitation and fisheries subsidies. But there is this new trend of looking at plurilateral negotiations as an anomaly. They are not. So maybe we need to have an intellectually clear and politically bold conversation about clarifying the rules once and for all so that we can proceed. And then we're talking about services. The GATS itself in Article 19 calls upon members to engage in plurilateral negotiations. So there is a specific mandate there. And if we capitalize on the paragraph coming out of MC13 that Sherry referred to, you can take that and it's what we make of it. And launching a plurilateral initiative that will, to the extent possible, bind existing levels of openness, develop new rules, not just on domestic regulation, but on other aspects as well that need to be further developed. We need to pay attention to the development dimension of this, and you have Article 4 of the GATS, which calls upon members to pursue the development interest of developing countries through negotiating outcomes. Now, you put all this together and you can come up with something that looks like a very decent negotiating initiative. The last thing I would say here is that in any effort of that kind, it would be terribly important to involve the private sector and engage private sector operators in playing the role of the reality check to ensure that whatever solutions are being devised in these negotiations actually correspond to the realities of the day-to-day business. There's a lot to unpack here, but let me stop here and let's see where this discussion is going to take us today. So back to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Hamid. Quite contentious in certain respects. I hope it leads to an interesting conversation, clarification of the moratorium and what it stands for, what it means, what you get from it, and also the whole question of plurilaterals. I think they're really important questions, and I think it would be useful to thrash out some of the differences on those, maybe not today, but in other sessions later if we don't have time for it today. But before I sort of wander off into those particular areas, because I'm only the chair after all, I think we should open for conversations, for discussions. So please let us know. Please put your hands up. I'm getting notices up here. I don't know why. Those who would like to speak. Now, somebody's put, okay, I see Alan Wolf, I see Stuart, I see Gabrielle. Let's go in that order. Alan.
Well, thank you very much to the three speakers and the inimitable chair of this panel. A question is, why are we where we are? I mean, the eminent sense, good sense spoken by the three speakers, and they say, oh, at the end, there's a leadership deficit. Well, the GATS itself was energized by the private sector way back when. Jim Robinson of American Express was one of several Americans on our side who pushed forward very vigorously for GATS. And Sherry gave figures on the importance of as did George, the services trade to the trading system, to the world economy. Why is there not a transmission from economic interest into government action? The members of the WTO carrying forward negotiating proposals of the kind that have been outlined this morning. And I don't see them. Thank you. Look forward to the comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that came out from what the others were saying is that there isn't really an absence of mandate, is there? We're not in one of those situations where we're trying to launch something and it's getting blocked at the gate and there's no launch. There actually are mandates right there ready for use, if I have understood correctly. So that does really raise the question of what's going on, who's blocking what, or is it a question just of countries not thinking that the WTO is the best place to do it, they want to do it somewhere else, or they don't think it needs doing? But I think these are the hard questions that are going to have to be answered unless you want to buy out of the argument that services are inevitably becoming a more important part of the world economy.
Patrick,
The richer economies get, the more intensive is their reliance on services. It's an irrefutable reality. So if we don't do services properly, that's just another reason why multilateralism can wither and die. Okay, Stuart.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and I hope everyone can hear me. And big thanks indeed to Sherry, George, and Hamid. I thought their initial comments were terrific, and a huge amount in there to discuss. I was thinking a little bit on the same lines as Alan in terms of what is missing. Why is there no traction despite the huge economic importance of trade and services? Why can't we get this traction in the WTO? And perhaps part of it, as Alan mentioned, is related to the private sector. But when I've discussed this with the private sector in the past, they always say, well, if we thought the WTO was going to do something, we'd be there. So it's become a sort of chicken and egg thing. Because the WTO is not making progress, the private sector is not engaged. But on the other hand, the WTO is not making progress because the private sector is not engaged. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. But in addition to that, the comment that I wanted to make relates to the fact that, in fact, it's not trade ministries or foreign ministries that are in charge of services domestically. There are a whole host of domestic regulators from a variety of authorities and ministries involved in regulating services trade. And, these regulators can be enthused about WTO activities, as we saw in the telecoms negotiations. In fact, the negotiations on telecoms, as Hamid would remember, were largely conducted by regulators from capitals, not by trade negotiators in Geneva. And so we need to generate or regenerate this type of interest from the regulators. And it's very difficult to know how to do that because some of the regulators, as I say, might be enthusiastic about the WTO, but others, could be rather defensive about that and think that the WTO is somehow muscling in on their area of responsibility. So this is difficult. And the thought I had, looking at paragraph 18 of the MC13 declaration, which Sherry mentioned, was that the members are committing to reinvigorate work on services through further thematic evidence-based discussions. Those were the words of the declaration. And I'm just wondering whether the Services Council or another body in the WTO could convene meetings of capital-based regulators in some way, a bit like, if you like, some of the UNCTAD expert groups, which in fact I found that regulators from capitals are quite keen on that because it's a network of regulators and they can discuss in their own language in their own technical terms, and that is useful to them, so that they do become engaged. So that's the thought that I would bring in, that perhaps the Services Council can convene meetings of regulators in some form or other and try to generate the interest back home in moving forward the trade in services agenda. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. On the last point, I mean, it seems to me arguable that we have an example of that possibility. The last one you mentioned from the standards area on the goods side, where it is a lot of the technocrats from capitals who actually deal with the regulations who come to those meetings, and that's why they're so active. George, I just wanted to ask for a reaction from you before we move on to what Stuart said about chickens and eggs and the business sector.
Thanks, Patrick. I'd agree with many of the points that Stuart made, particularly engaging with different line ministries within governments and regulators. It's not just enough to speak with sort of the trade departments when it comes to trade and services. And sometimes it's not even enough to talk to governmental bodies, particularly in the case of professional services, where you have the different professional bodies who act as whether it's to do with the qualifications or other elements of the service, the regulation of that particular services trade. It's quite a diverse network or ecosystem of stakeholders that you do need to engage. So there is a challenge there that needs to be overcome. In terms of chicken and the egg, I do agree with that. However, much more, I would like the conversation to be focused, particularly from the business perspective on okay, so where do we go from here? How do we start generating that leadership and those results in order to guarantee further progress? I think there is a broader issue around business engagement at the WTO. Whether you're talking, coming once a year at the public forum, and maybe attending, the outskirts of a ministerial, that doesn't garner the sort of day-to-day, week-to-week contact that's necessary in order to push these things forward. So I'm not just saying that it's the government side that's not engaging with the business community enough. I think it's also incumbent on the business community to say, hey, this matters. We need to do more than show up once a year and say services are important. So definitely work to do.
Thanks, George. Don Alejandro, my revered former boss, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good to see you. And thank the panelists. This is actually quite interesting. Actually, I'm going to use a comment that I heard from Patrick several years ago, in the sense that perhaps we have to come to realize that to achieve trade liberalization in services, trade negotiations are not a good way to do it. The evidence shows that we haven't had liberalization on services in the GATS, and even in the most ambitious free trade agreements, where presumably everything is on the table, what countries do is that they lock in their present situation and they park their existing restrictions. And I think this was illustrated in a paper by some of Hamid's former colleagues. I think Mamdouh, who's present here today, was one of the authors of that. And it showed that very little trade liberalization takes place, even in free trade agreements. And in most of those cases, what is there is because the country wanted to use the trade negotiation, the free trade agreement, to liberalize its a particular sector. For example, Costa Rica, what they did on telecommunications in the NAFTA negotiations. So perhaps one thing is that we should not expect to have trade negotiations in the classic way in the GATS to achieve liberalization. And the best, and I think Hamid said this very importantly, the gap should serve the purpose at the very least to lock in the present situation, the status quo. So that would be a great first step to achieve. And secondly, I fully agree with Stuart in the sense that if you want to do something, you have to go to the regulators, because they are the ones who understand the public policies behind the different regulatory frameworks on telecom, financial, professional, whatever. And in that sense, instead of thinking, I mean, perhaps the way to go now is to have sectoral initiatives, a plurilateral sector edition of particular services area to see what would be an optimal situation in terms of regulatory problems that may be hampering international trade. And then perhaps you can get some traction, but I don't see any other way, given the nature of the beast. And incidentally, I think if something is done on a sectoral basis, then you will get a lot of attention from the private sector that is interested in that particular sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Alejandro. Rajesh, you have some comments to make.
Thank you so much. First of all, this is my first attempt at speaking at this forum, having joined.
I know, welcome, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. Just very briefly, 2 comments. First, on the question that, why people are not interested in WTO negotiations. My experience of even working for technical assistance for developing countries tell me that how they view, the developing countries view services. They feel that it is the autonomous liberalization in the infrastructure services that will give them the maximum benefit. Therefore, what do I get by engaging in negotiations if it is the autonomous liberalization that will give me benefit of FDI, whatever. Second, whatever are their demands concerning mode 4, etc., they are not going to be met. They realize that because it is linked to the immigration laws and all that. So why WTO? Why not other routes? That's the first point. The second, I'm quite interested in what Hamid said, that looking at Avnet's trade alerts, that the divergence, regulatory divergence is appearing. I think that's a good starting point, to my mind, to give comfort to the countries to start negotiating for regulatory convergence. The reason being that if we can make a case after analysis of all those regulations which are emerging, whether the world is moving towards blocks, and therefore the multilateralism becomes important because of those regulatory divergences, etc. I think if the subject is approached that way, we may be able to generate enough interest amongst the majority of membership to actually engage in WTO negotiations, and rather than see that WTO negotiations only provides kind of a platform or the GATS structure. That's what I mean to say, the structure or the framework for negotiations to take place in other places. I hope that I'm making it understandable what I want to convey. Therefore, my point is that we have to come to the details or go to the details of regulatory divergences which are appearing in the new channels of services trade, to show that, to prevent world getting into blocks, whether 2 or 3 blocks, and bring them back to multilateralism and what effect it can have on the businesses. That's what needs to be done, to my mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Rajesh. The issue about convergence is certainly an interesting one, but I'm wondering whether convergence would be seen as a step too far by many regulators, and that we should be looking much more to the idea of equivalence, negotiated equivalence, because not everyone wants to do the things in the same way, but possibly we can agree that different ways of doing the same things get you to the place you need to be in terms of equivalence. Just a thought. One thing that Gabrielle Massot, I didn't realize that she had to leave. Otherwise, I would have given her the floor before. But she has gone, and she's written a message in the box saying, "I had asked to speak because I wonder whether there is a need to add negotiation on services in WTO or other forums. It may be that things in services are going well, and if there are problems in the private sector, we'll deal with the problems." Basically, she seems to be saying that the WTO might be surplus to requirements. Any comments on that? George.
Thank you. And this is something that we encounter from and just sharing our experience in the UK. So we have something called the UK Professional and Business Services Council, which encompasses pretty much every service provider who typically would wear a suit that aren't bankers. And that encompasses quite a range of size of firm. What we see when it comes to international trade is, like most trade, but even more prevalent in that if you are a big player, so an EY or another big four accountancy firm, if you're in, a large multinational law firm, then you will have dedicated teams to take care of your visa issues, to take care of your data protection protocols, to make sure that the servers are located in the right place for the right clients and have all of the associated contractual arrangements associated with that to make sure that you're complying around the world. If you were a small scale service supplier, say, a highly specialized engineer looking at a particular type of environmental engineering service, then you're not going to have that same capacity to deal with the barriers that come when you have international services trade issues like visas, like regulatory recognition, like managing your data flows. So overcoming those actually does become quite important if we have a multilateral system that has created a baseline that is easier for them to access. Not necessarily talking about liberalization here, but at least a baseline that they're able to navigate with more ease. And I think that, if that is a struggle for UK specialized firms, then it's something that's going to be shared by service providers across developing countries as well.
Yeah. Henry, good to see your hand up. Hope it's not too late at night for you. You have the floor, Henry. Henry? Henry? Hello. You have the floor.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry, I got a problem with the connection. But I was struck by what was mentioned earlier, regarding Gabrielle's comment as to whether or not services is already working, so there's no need. I think probably there's a deeper problem. I would say that the problem is that, to tie in with what I think it was Stuart who made this point earlier, that most of the services regulations are actually done by the different, functional ministries or the line agencies, which are not the trade ministry. So when the service providers run into problems in various countries, they are going to complain to these, line ministries. And they will not realize that actually this is something that they can bring, to the trade ministry, because most of them are probably not even aware that the WTO actually has rules which address the services issues. Because for them, when we talk about trade issues, most of the time we talk about tariffs, we talk about, anti-dumping rules and so on. We are not going to talk about services regulations. So I think this is something that maybe can be improved by better educating, the services providers, all these firms which engage in services, including law firms, consulting firms to help them understand that what they encounter actually could potentially be a trade issue and could be brought to the WTO, so as to gather some momentum for them to become more proactive in bringing the issue into the WTO, so as to help the countries to really highlight these issues in the WTO and hopefully bring them into negotiation. I think that should be the next step. Thanks.
Thanks, Henry. Thank you for that. Does anyone, before we ask the speakers to comment on any of the things that have been raised, is there anyone else who'd like to take the floor at this stage? I see no one. So let's can we go in reverse order for the speakers on this one? Start with Hamid.
Thank you. Excellent points raised. I will start with the role of the private sector, and I'll start with the last point that Gabriel raised. I think part of the problem really is that there is a little bit of a private sector awareness deficit as well about the WTO and what the WTO can do in terms of finding solutions to problems, because the majority of problems that are being faced by services suppliers, particularly at the level of SMEs and small businesses, are on the regulatory front. And they're looked at as regulatory issues, not really as trade barriers per se. They're barriers for them, but they're not fully aware of what kind of tools that exist in the WTO that could actually help find solutions to their problems. And I agree completely that the objective here, when we face regulatory diversity, is not to achieve any kind of harmonization. That's completely unrealistic, because we need to also understand that we're dealing with areas of regulations for which there are no internationally agreed technical standards. This is not like the TBT and the SPS, where we have international standards that we can use as a benchmark for rebuttable presumption of least trade restrictiveness. But what we should be aiming to promote is regulatory cooperation. Regulatory cooperation would create the kind of bridges between different regulatory systems in a way that facilitates cross-border and cross-jurisdictional trade and facilitate interoperability. Now, mutual recognition is one, but recognition simply without mutual could also work. There are exchanges of recognition of adequacy of regulatory standards or equivalence. I mean, there are multiple forms of these kind of regulatory cooperation instruments. And there is, of course, at the end, the establishment of systems like the US EU on privacy. They have different standards, but they create a regulatory bridge that allows cross-jurisdictional business. These are the things that I think we need to also pay a lot of attention to. But I go back to what Alan said about how the GATS was actually created on the back of a huge effort and a great deal of political energy generated by the private sector. And that's what we are missing now. And part of the problem, as George said, is that the private sector, particularly the small players, are not really aware of the possibility of what the WTO can do. Now, here, let me add a point about RTAs, because we shouldn't actually look at RTAs in the WTO as substitutes, because as Alex said, the experience of RTAs really in terms of liberalization is quite limited in terms of opening new market access opportunities. But where RTAs have actually advanced is on the regulatory issues. This is where they've come up with innovative solutions and innovative approaches. I'm not saying that they are directly transposable or transferable to a multilateral system, but they inspire solutions that can be applied multilaterally, even through side arrangements like regulatory cooperation. And here, just a footnote, regulatory cooperation arrangements are usually not part of the trade agreement itself, but are allowed by the trade disciplines, like what we have in the GATS Article 7 on recognition, in order to ensure that these are not being used as disguised restrictions. Now, I think the last point I would add here is about the relationship between the private sector and the WTO Secretariat. And this is a terribly, terribly important part of the picture, because I recall throughout our history, not just during the drafting of the GATS, but even subsequently, our relationship with the private sector was always on a day-to-day basis. When we were developing the regulatory disciplines on the accountancy sector, we were on continuous contact with the International Federation of Accountants. The private sector, those who do the business, are actually the reality check for whatever rulemaking exercise takes place, to make sure that what we're doing is actually relevant to solving the real problems. And that needs to be depoliticized a bit, because I think if we go back and look at the big picture, one thing we need actually really in the WTO is much, much less politicization and much more focus on the substantive and technical issues. And let me stop here. There's a lot more to say, but I'll leave space for others to speak as well. So back to you, Patrick.
Thank you for that. George.
Thank you. In terms of the approach, and I won't try to repeat what Hamid said, which I very much agree with, but I think we do need a tiered approach to this. If we start from the premise that services trade is important and a growing share of economic activity when it comes to international trade, and more can be done at the WTO, then I think that tiered approach will be very necessary into building momentum and eventually progress. The first is very much around information sharing, improving transparency, notifications, and moving towards that regulatory dialogue that is incredibly important when it comes to comparing different national practices as it relates to regulating services trade and cross-border provision of regulated services. You then move to regulatory cooperation, whether that's through some sort of equivalence adequacy mechanism or through a more formal channel that remains to be seen and will depend sector by sector as to what's possible in that space. And then you eventually move to market access and sort of the real crafting of new multilateral disciplines when it comes to international services trade. One of the things that I would reflect on is where you do have an active services community, they will always be pushing for the most ambitious outcome. You will have WTO members who will take the opposite view and say, well, no, agriculture is more important, or another particular WTO issue. And it's that tension that I think we need, but in order to drive these discussions forward and ultimately build momentum to something that does mean the organization is representative of trade as it's happening around the world and into the future.
Thank you. Sherry. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. And excellent discussion on the part of everyone. I really, really enjoyed it. I think we need to do this more often, but I want to sort of distill, I think, kind of what I've heard all around into two major areas that I think the WTO can be really useful in for services. And I think I want to preface this by saying I totally agree with Alejandro. What we've observed and learned over the past 30 years is that the WTO hasn't really played a role in liberalizing services trade. We expected it to do that. It didn't do that. But we've seen that regional trade agreements haven't done that either. So what we've learned is that governments don't liberalize services trade through going into trade agreements. But what they do is they consolidate regulatory openness, they consolidate and they make these regulations transparent. So they basically bind openness at the level of regulatory legal practice. And that's very important. So with that lesson learned, we should stop expecting the WTO to liberalize services trade. We need to change our mindset. But what does the WTO need to do, and what should we expect it to do? And what can it do? And it should, and it can provide transparency and predictability around services trade. That's very important, and it's not doing that at present. Why? Because the commitments that were agreed and negotiated, or not even negotiated, but agreed 30 years ago, are not adequate today. They haven't been updated and they haven't been expanded. So what can the WTO do to increase this transparency and predictability, which is its responsibility in the area of services? One, it could reach an agreement that members bind existing openness. As Hamid and many others have said, they lock in the status quo. And Alejandro mentioned too. So that's very important. That would not be terribly difficult, but it would be important to get them to agree on. Two, they could expand and should expand the current coverage of services commitments. I have an idea of what I've called a 70 to 10 formula. They need to agree not to liberalize the service subsectors in the WTO 120 Rev 2, but they need to agree to expand their commitments so that they could reach a certain percentage level. For example, 90 subsectors in the W120 Rev 2 for developed countries and 75 for developing and fewer for the least developed, but with a requirement to include those sectors that contribute greater than 10% of the country's services trade as a part of this 70% commitment. So this would make services more predictable, services trade, and more transparent. So the WTO could do that. That doesn't have to be that formula. It could be any formula. It could be any understanding. But once it's reached, you don't require a further negotiation. You simply require WTO members to comply with that agreed obligation. And the second area, and that would avoid services being linked to any other negotiating issue in the WTO. I think it's really important we stick away. We stay away from that. That's why another reason that services just fell off the negotiating agenda, because they were one of the tripods, but they were a tripod that was never paid attention to. So we need to kind of separate them from our discussions on manufacturing, agriculture, fisheries, whatever else is being talked about. The services universe is wide enough to be discussed on its own and not to be linked to any other aspect. And the importance of services speaks to that, and WTO members really need to understand this better. And perhaps if they understand that they're not going to be asked to liberalize per se, just to make the trading system predictable and transparent for services trade, it will be easier for them to engage in this. The second major area where the WTO can make progress and has not, and many people have mentioned this, and I think it's excellent, we should go further, is that of what you have suggested as regulatory cooperation, but I would go further and I would call it regulatory coherence. And I think regulatory coherence includes both regulatory cooperation, but it also includes an understanding of what constitutes good regulatory practice. So this would involve the WTO entering a little bit the area of soft law. It never has. I know Patrick has suggested this for a long time. But given the understanding, the absolute importance of regulations in the services area, WTO members could, without threatening anyone, start a discussion of what constitutes good regulatory practice for services, how to achieve this. What is regulatory coherence? What does it involve? It could involve harmonization, probably not. It could involve recognition, probably. It could involve other ways of determining equivalence. But good regulatory practice goes beyond, and this is important to understand, the recent disciplines agreed on services domestic regulation. That's a part of good regulatory practice, but it's not all of it, just a part. good regulatory practice encompasses looking at the entire life cycle of the regulation. And the WTO could do something similar to what APEC has done in developing guidelines for good regulatory practice for services, or just reaching an understanding on that. This would benefit tremendously developing economies as they try to improve their regulatory practices to achieve more efficient services outcomes. And I think that this focus on regulations could be done usefully, as many have mentioned, through a sectoral focus, or through a cluster approach to services discussions. And this could group a cluster of services together that are related to deliver this an optimum services output. And this is what APEC did with its focus on logistics-related services over the last 2 years, that allowed APEC economies to understand better how groups of logistics-related services work together, and to agree on guidelines for treatment of these services during periods of health crisis, so that supply chain operations will not be adversely affected. This is just one example of what could happen through a focus on regulation, good regulatory practice, through either sectoral or a cluster approach. So I'm going to stop here, but I do think there are useful things the WTO can absolutely do, learning from RTAs, as Hamid mentioned, also learning from APEC progress. And these lie in those areas that I mentioned: improving predictability and transparency through binding, and through expanding the scope of services commitments. And secondly, through moving to a greater focus on regulatory coherence. So thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Sherry. This emphasis on regulation seems to me necessarily beyond a certain level of generalization to need a very sector-specific approach. But anyhow, Stuart.
Thanks, Patrick. No, I just put my hand up again because I very much agree with what Sherry's just said about the need to promote good regulatory practice and to look at what others are doing in this field. I think of APEC as well as Sherry has done. I mean, years and years ago, we used to discuss APEC in the WTO and say it was just a talk shop and they never get anywhere. And we, on the other hand, in the WTO, we're hard law people, hard and fast obligations, etc. Well, the tables have turned now. APEC has made progress and the WTO hasn't. So I think we need to learn some lessons and take that on board. On Sherry's other point, actually, I was less sure about that. Sherry said that, services should go ahead on its own. Of course, services negotiations were launched in the year 2000 for Doha, and they didn't really get much traction. Hamid might disagree with me on that. I don't think too much happened. And the same with agriculture, under the built-in agenda of the Uruguay round, nothing happened. So that's why we had a round. Of course, the round foundered in the end, so maybe thing is coming back full circle, but it's an interesting debate on that point, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left. I see Hamid has shown me a couple of fingers. Yes, Hamid.
Now, I just want to add something, just follow up on what Stuart just said. I think this question of linkages with other negotiating agendas is something that is very difficult. It's very inconvenient sometimes. It's very difficult to escape from. And let's not forget, when we launched the services negotiations in 2000, we had what we called the built-in agenda, which was agriculture and services. And that was part of the design of the creation of the WTO, because these two areas were actually put on the right track for that kind of further negotiations. But then they got folded into the Doha round, and then, of course, as you know, the rest is history. But speaking of linkages, that reminded me of 2008, actually, and the signaling conference for services, because that was at a point when we were very, very close, at a striking distance from agreeing on ag and NAMA modalities at the time. And then we said, we saw the linkages actually working in favor of services. And that's when the European Commission said, hang on, we're not going to agree to modalities until we see what we can get on services. And they asked for the signaling conference. And it was quite surprising, the kind of jump that we had in the level of initial offers at the time, and the level of pledged promises for improved services commitments was quite, I remember at the time, I was sitting and Charlene Barshevsky, the USCR at the time, was sitting next to me. And at the end of the signaling conference, she linked to me and said, well, this really exceeded our expectations. So in other words, I think the point I'm making here is that there are political dynamics that we have to manage as we see. But I also agree with what Sherry said about the services agenda being wide enough to provide its own balance within. And there, I think there's a lot that can be done and a lot that needs to be unpacked. The last point I want to make is going back to what Stuart said earlier about possible discussions in the Services Council that would involve regulators. Of course, I think that would be an excellent idea. And at some point that used to happen. You see, part of the problem is that, like what happens in the WTO all the time, once you have a negotiation, the deliberative function subsides. It happened even during the Uruguay round. And what the deliberative function of the WTO should perform normally is somewhat similar to the kind of discussions that take place in EPEC, that discussions that unpack issues and try to find solutions going forward. A good sample of that actually is what was done in the Services Council way back in '99 in the e-commerce work program. And I would refer you to an old document S/L/74, which is it was a report by the Services Council on what? On how members at the time saw how the articles of the GATS would apply to e-commerce transactions. Can you imagine having a discussion like that today that looks at the provisions, the articles of an agreement, and then start actually producing understandings, collective understandings of the membership about how the articles apply to electronic commerce transactions? So we need to sort of reboot the deliberative function in order to be able to unpack some of those complex issues. And that would be the end of what I have to say. And thank you so much.
Okay, I just want to say one thing about, we're talking a lot about regulatory coherence, regulatory cooperation. That's fine, and that's because services are very regulation intensive. But it doesn't get us away from the reality that we have to worry about market access. And when you think about national treatment is as much about market access as it is about regulatory coherence. So I don't think we can avoid that. And if we had better commitments under GATS on national treatment, we wouldn't be able to criticize the moratorium in the way we do.
I would completely agree with that, because national treatment at the end of the day is about conditions of competition, and
yeah, exactly.
And the national treatment provision of the GATS applies to de jure and de facto discrimination. So there is it's a powerful instrument, and we've seen through dispute settlement in the past how far that can go. But you're absolutely right. And this is where the consolidation of existing levels of openness through market access and national treatment commitments, as things stand now, I think we go a very long way in that direction.
Yeah, because in the old days we used to say it's all about tariffs and then national treatment's the backup, so you can't cheat on the tariffs. But actually, in services, it's sort of like the other way around. But they're linked, inevitably linked. Sorry, Alejandro.
No, thank you. Sorry to intervene a second time, but it's a little time. In particular, George Riddell, he underlined the importance of achieving more transparency, and he mentioned notifications. And I'll submit that perhaps one should not expect improvement on transparency through notifications done by governments, that is reality of trade in goods and even more on services. And I think that the Secretariat has done a fantastic job on the database ITIPS with the cooperation of the World Bank. So, I mean, beef up those exercises and you can go a long way to achieve this public good of transparency. And speaking of which, I asked the question whether there is room for improvement on W120 in terms of the nomenclature for trade and services. And I think that there is a lot that can be done, and perhaps work should be undertaken sectorally, even and even on a plurilateral basis, and that would also help the transparency exercise. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, we have 5 minutes, and we have 2 panelists who want to say what will be their last words. George.
Thanks, Patrick. Completely agree with Alejandro that, definitions, nomenclature can definitely be improved. Also, how we collect services trade data, there's a lot of methodological issues around that. That's probably a discussion for another time. Probably just sort of riffing a little bit off of Hamid's thinking around sort of the political aspects of this, and perhaps more pragmatically from my times as a delegate. We are reaching the end of the current crop of plurilateral negotiations. Domestic regulation is, being certified, investment facilitation substantively done, e-commerce, yes, some tricky issues, but we, a huge amount of work's gone into approaching finalization of that agreement. There will be a point sometime soon where a number of ministers turn around and go, cool, what can I launch? And I think one of the points around that is how best can we capture something that will be materially and commercially meaningful to improve services trade at the WTO, given their importance. So I'll end with that thought.
Thanks a lot, George. Hamid, it looks as if you have wheedled your way into having the last word.
No, I just want to, I agree with what George just said, but the reason why I took the floor is to go back to Alejandro's point about W120. And here, and I should have mentioned this earlier, I think we should not forget that W120 was actually developed in the early 90s based on the provisional CPC. So that classification was done 30 years ago. In the meantime, you fast forward to today and you see that the CPC itself has been revised several times. And if you look at the latest version of the CPC, you will see that there's a lot of advancement in the services classification, particularly at the digital service level. And it clarifies a lot of matters that are currently covered under the moratorium, but are now classified as services, which opens the door towards a proper negotiating initiative that captures commitments on those products in order to solve the problems that we referred to earlier about guaranteeing national treatment and protecting against discriminatory taxation, but also guaranteeing market access for all digital products. So it is important actually in whatever we do next that we look at the classification issues, because it has a lot of implications going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamid. Now, Sherry wishes to deny you the last word. So Sherry, the last word is yours.
Many thanks,
2
Patrick.
minutes.
2 seconds. Man, thanks to everybody. I just want to give a shout out to the WTO Secretariat because I think they fully understand the importance of services and services trade. And I just want to say that the new Global Services Trade Data Hub is a great asset for the trade community and for trade officials in Geneva, and that, the WTO Secretariat is fully on board and understands these issues and prepared to go forward. So if, as George said, if WTO members could find the leadership to start some type of initiative that would simply bind existing openness in services trade and understand the importance that this would bring, we could go far, particularly given attention, as Hamid said, to the new classification of digitally delivered services. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry, very much. Well, I think we've had a rich conversation, a lot of material. There is a recording, so I think there are some parts that I at least will want to listen to get key elements out of it. Thank you all very much for your contributions, and see you next time, whenever that might be. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.